There is a big difference between hyperinflation and inflation. Regular inflation might amount to a single or double-digit percentage increase in prices over a period of months or years. While this price increase is painful for consumers who are trying to make ends meet, it's nowhere near as bad as hyperinflation. You see, hyperinflation is inflation's evil twin. Hyperinflation, as implied by the prefix hyper, is inflation on steroids. Economists use the term hyperinflation to refer to excessive, rapid, and out-of-control increases in prices of goods and services in an economy. Generally, for it to be hyperinflation, the monthly inflation rate needs to be higher than 50% and should last for more than a month. Hyperinflation often goes hand in hand with supply shortages, extreme poverty, and a collapse of a country's entire financial structure. People lose their life savings as a nation's currency becomes worthless. The cost of basic necessities skyrockets. At its worst, everything from food, utilities, and rent can double in price in mere days. As history shows us, hyperinflation is terrifying. That's why it's important to understand its causes. In this video, we'll show you 5 examples of the worst hyperinflation the world has ever experienced, along with discussing the circumstances leading up to each event. Example number 1. Hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic, Germany, 1922 to 1923. After Germany lost World War I, it faced a crippling reparation payment of 132 billion gold marks, about 269 billion in today's money. What followed was a German payment default and French and Belgian occupation of Germany's industrial region. German industrial workers' resistance began a cascading collapse of the entire German economy. The Weimar government ordered workers to passively resist the foreign occupiers. In exchange, the government would continue to pay the workers' wages. The problem was the government didn't have any money to pay its striking workers, so it simply printed some. This was not the first time the government printed money in response to a crisis. It did this throughout the war to pay for expenses. Of course, as the government printed more money, it became worth less and less, and inflation skyrocketed. German inflation by November 1923 was so extreme that one American dollar was the equivalent of 4.2 trillion marks. People lost their savings, food became scarce, and rioting ensued. The government ended the chaos by replacing the old currency with a new one, called the Rentenmark. The government put strict quantity limits on the Rentenmark. They backed the new currency by essentially mortgaging Germany's agricultural and industrial resources. Example 2. Hyperinflation in Hungary, 1945 to 1946. Hungary, toward the end of World War II, was the battleground between Russian and German troops. By the end of the war, 40% of Hungary's national wealth had been destroyed, and much of the nation's industrial capability lay in ruins. All that destruction caused consumer goods scarcity and rising prices, with no tax base to fill the gap. The Hungarian government tried to stimulate the economy by printing money and lending to banks at low rates. Banks in turn lent the money to companies, flooding the country with loans. At the height of Hungarian inflation, the daily inflation rate was 207%, and prices doubled every 15 hours. Simultaneously, the government stopped collecting taxes, whose daily payment couldn't keep up with inflation. The result was that workers lost 80% of their earnings, pushing many families into extreme poverty. From August 1945 through July 1946, Hungary experienced the highest inflation ever recorded. Inflation stabilized after the government introduced tax reforms and a new currency, the forint, which was backed by gold reserves and world currencies. In 1949, Hungary's political fate was sealed when communists seized power and the nation fell within the Soviet sphere, with a new constitution and a centrally planned economy modeled on the Soviet Union. Example 3. Hyperinflation in Yugoslavia, 1992 to 1994. Years of fighting and civil wars that led to the disintegration of former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s also marked the beginning of hyperinflation. Compounded by worldwide economic sanctions, low production, and falling tax revenues, prices in Yugoslavia in 1994 were increasing by 313 million% each month. This heightened the suffering of a population already reeling from the impacts of civil war and ethnic unrest. The Yugoslav government responded to international sanctions and resulting inflation by issuing a single banknote with a record denomination of 500 billion dinars. This banknote also failed and eventually was worth a mere 1,000th of a cent. This perfect storm of irrational monetary policy and a government that faced an unpayable budget deficit lasted for 25 months. As political stability returned, the government embarked on a monetary reconstruction program that replaced the national currency and stabilized the exchange rate. Example 4. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, 2007 to 2008. In 2006, Zimbabwe experienced an annual inflation rate of above 1,000%. Factors leading to high inflation included a turbulent history of internal political unrest, international sanctions, excessive government spending, and a collapse of the country's agricultural infrastructure. By 2008, prices doubled about every 24 hours. People needed to bring plastic bags full of currency to the store just to buy a loaf of bread. The government's response was to devalue the currency with a world record $100 trillion note and institute price and wage freezes. In 2009, Zimbabwe started using foreign currencies like the South African rand and the US dollar. Still facing the effects of inflation, by 2010, the government adopted U.S. monetary policy that included controls on government spending and promoting economic growth. Example 5. Hyperinflation in Venezuela, 2016 to 2021. Venezuela has the dubious distinction of being a country that has suffered from one of the longest periods of hyperinflation. According to the country's central bank, Venezuela's annual inflation rate was 686.4% in 2021, down from 2020 when inflation hit 2,959.8%. But that's nothing compared to the country's inflation rate in 2018, which the International Monetary Fund, IMF, estimated to be at over 65,000%. Venezuela was once a major oil exporter. Gross mismanagement and internal fuel shortages have crippled production and reduced output to a mere trickle. A rise in consumer prices, political repression, supply chain breakdowns, labor shortages, and a sudden burst in government spending after pandemic lockdowns continues to bury Venezuela in one of the worst economic depressions in the history of the world. So, to recap, we've seen how political instability, wars, and a government's bad monetary policy can ruin a country's economy, wreck its currency, and cause hyperinflation. The big question is, could hyperinflation happen in the U.S. and other developed nations? While the U.S. is experiencing what federal government economists describe as a temporary bump in the inflation rate, the prospect of out-of-control hyperinflation, according to some experts, is unlikely. Those experts who disagree are not as optimistic. Some believe that the U.S. is headed toward hyperinflation because of the trillions of dollars spent as economic stimuli during the global pandemic. This was on top of the trillions of dollars in debt the U.S. had already accumulated in the previous decades. They say that inflation is a massive tax that redistributes wealth from businesses and individuals to the federal government. At some point, this unpayable debt may lead to an entire economic collapse as people lose confidence in their government and nation's currency. So, what's your opinion? Are the world's largest economies too big to fail? That is, immune to hyperinflation? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave your comments below. And while you're at it, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps our channel out and we appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.